Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I'm here at the News Forum where all voices matter. In honor of Remembrance Day, Boom and Bust is pleased to welcome Dr. John Robson. He is a professor at Augustine College. He is a National Post columnist, and for the purposes of this broadcast, noted historian with a PhD in American history from the University of Texas. Our purpose today, in order to honor the sacrifices of those who took up arms to protect our freedom, is to discuss China's challenges to the world economic and political order. Welcome, John.
Thank you.
I guess the first question is a pretty broad one, but if you could give our viewers an historical perspective on the current state of the world's geopolitics, that'd be a good place to start.
I would start by saying we have been here before, that we are facing certain particular circumstances that are troubling, and some of them are technological. But the idea that we have an open world order in which we have, solid currencies and largely free trade, and we aim for the peaceful settlement of disputes, and democratic governance guides the most powerful nations in the world. This has been the case for most of the last 500 years, but it's been challenged repeatedly. And on Remembrance Day, of course, we tend to think primarily of the two world wars, partly because the death on such a large scale. But I always make sure that I remember the others too, those who fought the Spanish Armada, those who stood up to Napoleon, those at Waterloo. It's about as far from Waterloo to Vimy Ridge as from Vimy Ridge to today. And they all had this understanding, whether articulate or just intuitive, that a world dominated by undemocratic powers, a world dominated by governments that sought to use economics as a weapon of geopolitical dominance would be a very uncomfortable world to live in. And that is true, in fact, of the First World War. Again, even the First World War gets overshadowed by the Second. I mean, Hitler was just so evil that it's hard to appear sinister when standing on the same stage as him. But the Kaiser's regime was not a benevolent one. And so when we look at the threat from China, we've had this before where we had a rising power that wanted to disrupt the status quo, not in order to be like those nations that were already dominant in the world, but in order to change the world into a much less friendly place.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, because we went through about 20 years, the last 20 years, looking at the People's Republic of China and saying, well, China is going to grow in influence and importance, but as long as they're within our multinational institutions like the WTO and the IMF, we can manage their growth in power and authority. But that really hasn't happened. So in that sense, that you've seen that before as well. Is that correct?
Oh, we certainly have. I mean, again, if you look at the settlement coming out of World War I, and initially there's quite a punitive peace imposed on Germany, although if you're going to complain about reparations, you should remember that Germany imposed very heavy reparations on France after the War of 1870, and the French paid it off. But you see in the 20s a very real effort to reintegrate Germany into the world economy and into the community of nations. There are substantive American plans to deal with the war debts. Charles Dawes produces one of the major ones. And as a reward, he becomes Calvin Coolidge's running mate in the 1924 election, becomes vice president. So Americans weren't detached from this either. But there came a point at which the effort had failed. And one of the real problems of the 1930s, and I'll parenthetically, you can't blame those who made the Versailles settlement for the errors of the 30s, but there was a failure to recognize that it hadn't worked. For whatever reason, and wherever the blame goes, at some point you say to yourself, as you now say with China, we thought that prosperity and respect would mellow them. It's done the opposite. And we have a real problem on our hands because they did get stronger, but they didn't get nicer. And the government didn't get more like our kind of governments. And now we face a dangerous enemy, not a rising partner.
Yeah, and of course, when you and we've got about 30 seconds before the break, we'll carry on the conversation afterwards. But really, there's no chance within Chinese society of an alternative point of view, is there?
At the moment, there doesn't seem to be. And if Xi Jinping detects one, he will certainly try to quash it.
Welcome to Counterpoint. What concerns you about Canada right now?
That we have zero leadership.
We need to begin thinking about what comes next. now.
Public is a lot smarter than policymakers often let on.
We have normalized the absence of informed consent.
And that's kind of like the adult in the room conversation that
Yes.
a lot of people have wanted to have happen.
For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.
Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, here with an historian. I think this is a first for me to have an historian on my program, Dr. John Robson, talking about really the historical precedents around China's rise and some of the other geopolitical issues. So I guess when you look at China's economic might, its military might, I guess one of the questions in my mind and in other minds as well is that sustainable? We talked before the break about the authoritarian nature of the Chinese regime. It makes it seem monolithic, but you as an historian might have a more nuanced view on this, John. What's your take?
My take is that it's not sustainable and that's part of the problem. I think it was Edward Luttwak who wrote about one of the reasons that World War I happened is that Germany was in a strong immediate position. It was a great deal militarily more powerful than both France and Russia, but the long-term path of economic development in both France and Russia seemed to be that they'd catch up on Germany. And that's why, in fact, in the summer of 1914, when the crisis erupted, the Kaiser said, it's now or never. And therefore, they made the decision to go to war. And I think if I were the Chinese leadership, I would be very worried about the legitimacy of the regime, about the environmental problems that they face, about the increasing financial problems, this debt and the major real estate empire that looks like it's going to go under. They have spent a lot of money buying friends in Africa, but someday they may find that their friends don't want to give them the money back or haven't got it. So there's a real sense, I fear, in the Chinese leadership, as in Wilhelmine, Germany, that if we strike now, we can take these guys. But if we wait, our problems may turn out to be even worse than theirs. But the Chinese economy is a house of cards. I've been saying this for years. It's like the old huckster's joke, we're going to lose money on every sale, but make it up in volume. They are exporting goods for less than it costs to make them. When you think about the labor that goes into it, the environmental destruction, and to some extent, the breach of trust, such as there is between the government and the people, that the Chinese people are not getting what the Communist Party promised them. And the longer you tell them you have to wait, we have this plan. And as with the Soviets, right, at some point when the sausages didn't appear in the stores, people simply stopped believing anything the regime had said, as appears to merely not believing 3/4 of it.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting point because there has been some commentary that Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, does see, the clock is ticking, both on his own mortality as leader for life, but also on the circumstances that currently exist that are in China's favor. The Chinese rhetoric is that America is in inexorable decline, yet it seems that China's government is rushing through things, being more aggressive on Taiwan or the South China Sea. That seems like a government in a hurry, doesn't it?
It is. And you raise the point that I think is often overlooked, that Xi Jinping himself is 68 now. When Hitler launched World War II, apparently he said, oh, my goodness, I'm already 50. I'm too old to conquer the world. Get moving, guys. But I do think also, the West is in inexorable decline. Ha, ha, ha. But, somehow the West's been in inexorable decline for centuries, and it never seems to get weaker. It's the adversaries, it's the Napoleons and the Louis XIVs that wind up by the roadside. But I think they may well be thinking that we can go after Taiwan now. We've got the capability. We've got the hypersonic missiles. The United States is in turmoil and confusion, but we can't count on them staying there. And again, although our problems worry me a lot, I wouldn't trade them for the Chinese Politburo's problems. And they may have the same sense that, China's GDP, it's important to remember, China's got this huge GDP and so on. Their GDP was bigger than that of Britain in 1800. But it sure wasn't China that was invading Britain, fighting opium wars, right, carving up the melon, in that classic Chinese phrase about the spheres of influence. So, but this is very worrisome, especially if, as autocratic regimes tend to do, they overestimate their chances. The Kaiser wasn't getting a lot of hang on, this might not work. Hitler certainly wasn't, not a lot of people going to Brezhnev's office and saying, buddy, we're up against it. And so we've got to be very clear that we understand the threat and that we are prepared to meet it and that we're capable of meeting it. Because otherwise they might, tyrannies underestimate free societies over and over again. It's one of the lessons of history. And to some extent, you can't stop it. But to the extent that you can at least influence it. After Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt said in astonishment, what kind of people do they think we are? And the only person in the Japanese senior leadership who did know was Yamamoto, because he'd lived in the United States and worked there. And he said attacking Pearl Harbor was a bad idea, even if it worked. But I don't know who's around Xi Jinping to say, look, we may not get across the Straits of Taiwan, but even if we do, that's going to bring the West together against us, and we will regret it.
We got to take a brief break for a commercial, but hold that thought. We'll come right back to it. Please stay with us. And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Dr. John Robson of Augustine College, talking about the big picture items. John, I had to cut you off because of the break, but please continue with your thought.
Right. We just got into Pearl Harbor, and the attack that worked almost perfectly. They didn't catch the American aircraft carriers there, but otherwise it went according to plan. But it's only 7 months from there till the American crushing defeat of the Japanese at Midway, using outdated planes, outnumbered, inferior technology, and superior improvisation and dynamic critical self-analysis. And the Chinese aren't going to be aware of that. They're going to see why it happened. But hovering over them, how do the Western societies keep winning wars they ought to lose? We should have lost World War II, probably should have lost World War I, but we didn't. But we need to communicate to the Chinese leadership that we have your number. Okay. And there is a place for you in a peaceful and civilized world if you could just calm down a bit and stop trying to conquer everything and be less horrifyingly communist. But if you push this, you're going to wind up in the graveyard of the tyrants who thought the West was weak and decadent.
Yeah, no, great point. But that does lead us to my next question, which is, from your point of view and from the point of view of history, are Western leaders correctly grappling with how to respond to this challenge?
I should think it's highly unlikely. We have a very strong track record of not doing it. The extent to which the West gets caught unprepared in war after war, even with the Battle of the Bulge, right after the Germans sort of drive through the left flank of the French in 1914 and again in 1940, we say in 1944, well, that could never happen. But there is this extraordinary resilience, including in the governance of free societies. There are reasons we don't have time to get into here to worry that Western societies are less resilient than they used to be, including, I will mention, the loss of religious faith. That's actually a more serious problem than people think. But luckily, it doesn't seem to matter that our leaders are caught napping, because they consistently are. And remember Churchill versus Neville Chamberlain sort of scenario. But the world is moving faster, so I think it's more dangerous than it used to be. The idea that Justin Trudeau is ready for this is laughable. Joe Biden, on the other hand, though there are concerns about his health, he's one of the last of the Cold War liberals like Henry Jackson. He understands the menace of China, and I hope to goodness the American military does. And we need a military. What would it matter if we did know, if we don't prepare? And we went into World War II, where we had 6 tanks. We had guys drilling literally on infantry exercises with sticks shouting bang. Well, they're not going to give us 6 months or a year this time. So if we know what's going on, we need to double our military budget. I know that sounds crazy, but we do. We need to double our military budget because freedom is worth defending. That's the other lesson, surely, from all these struggles, all these crises, all these victories snatched from the jaws of defeat, is that freedom has to be defended, and freedom is worth defending.
Do you get that sense that Canadian society is up to that challenge right now?
I think Canadian society is up to it to a much greater extent than our government. It's remarkable how much more common sense there is on strategic matters, it seems to me, among the general populace. And again, I think that's always been true. I think that most normal people disliked Hitler a lot more than most politicians did until the crunch came in 1939. But it has to be focused in effective ways. I mean, look at the number of people in our military. How are we going to expand our military to fight a high-tech war if one should erupt? It took years to get the hang of things in World War I. In World War II, we almost lost it all in the first 6 months. So I think it's there latent. But I think we shouldn't just sit around counting on our good luck. I think we need to get a little more focused on the fact that we live in a dangerous world, and far and away the most dangerous thing in it is China. and it's growing sort of ominous alliances with other weaker but equally unpleasant forces.
I'm going to continue this conversation after the break, but I want to give you the question or frame it properly before we get there. Basically, this is a slightly different take, but Western countries have been facing backlash in recent years, populist backlash. A lot of it has to do with economic disparity or the fact that huge cross sections of the population, say in the UK or the US, have been ignored by the political class for decades, and finally had found their voice or found someone who was willing to be their tribune. That's really marked a lot of Western politics, even in Western Europe over the last little while. So I want to get your thoughts on that, because I think that's the other thing that's framing our geopolitical system right now. But I want to give you more time than we have right now, because we're just about to go to a break. So John Robson, ruminate on that, and we'll be back to you after the break. Please stay with us. And we're back here at Boom Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Dr. John Robson. John, I gave you a big intro there before we went to the break about sort of some of the populist and some of the other trends because of economic disparity, and maybe for other reasons that you could elucidate on. What's your take on all this?
I think you have put your finger on another of the serious problems, the growing gap between much of the populace and the elite. And the fact that patriotism, especially in the United States, patriotism has become controversial for pretty much the first time in American history. But on the other hand, I was just watching video. Winsome Sears, who's the newly elected lieutenant governor, or lieutenant governor, I suppose, if it were here, down in Virginia, who is a remarkable American success story. And she's an immigrant from Jamaica who joined the Marines before she became an American citizen. And you can see that there is still a lot of patriotism. And then I was thinking of the Kipling's verse about Tommy Atkins, and it's Tommy this and Tommy that and chuck him out the brute. But it's hero of his country when the guns begin to shoot. And to some extent, I think, curiously, there's always been somewhat more patriotism amongst the people who maybe got less of a deal than there has been among the people who were at the top. Or Colin Kaepernick saying the NFL draft is like slavery, and then continuing to try to get jobs in the NFL and make millions and millions of dollars, while a bunch of people who don't make millions are sitting in the stands thinking, don't go running down my country. We know it has failings, but this is America, and this is still the land of the free. But there's and the latest thing, of course, this idea that now we should get rid of the fossil fuels that our economy depends on, and if the little guy's having trouble paying the bills while Biden's going around in 80-car motorcades and Boris Johnson's taking private jets, there's a lot of strain on social cohesion here. And, someday the West may really fall apart and some tyrant may win by default. But again, boy, they've underestimated us again and again, and it's been a terrible mistake. Hitler thought Americans couldn't fight, thought they were mongrels or something.
But I mean,
you don't understand free societies.
Yeah, and this is a good point, because I mean, you're, as an American historian yourself, you know that the Gilded Age happened in the U.S. starting in the 1870s, but after that was the rise of this progressive force in reaction to that, to level things out again. Do you think that's possible again?
Well, I think it is. It's such a complicated problem in terms of the neoliberal order seeming not to have helped the little guy in the way that it was meant to. But it's certainly making government even bigger isn't going to help. I mean, one of the problems is modern life is so complicated, so rule-bound. The elite can navigate it, and ordinary people are having a lot of trouble. But I remember what Adam Smith said when someone came to him, wrote to him and said, "Oh, the Battle of Yorktown, Britain is ruined." And Adam Smith said, "There's a lot of ruin in a nation." That especially in the United States, and again, another really troubling sign, for the first time ever in American history, attendance at church is beginning to correlate with partisan affiliation. And that's a very corrosive thing. But again, I think there's so much strength, and I think there's so much capacity for free societies to revive. We need less government in most areas and more government in national security. We need more seriousness in our politicians, and we need more sense of pride that Canada is great, not because we deny our failings, but because we admit them, we face them, we try to fix them. And again, you look at this huge, you mentioned the Gilded Era, there's a huge surge of immigration that period. And people worry, oh, these immigrants, they're un-American, they're this, they're that. But they become the most patriotic. Archie Bunker kind of characters are the descendants of these immigrants who came to America and went from being oppressed and downtrodden to being homeowners and proud, self-sustaining citizens, and loved America because of that. So I think there's a lot of strength in the West. It's just that we need to somehow get that across to the Chinese Communist Party so they don't make a terrible miscalculation. And that is something that when you look at leaders like Justin Trudeau or Emmanuel Macron, you think to yourself, okay, I think we need another election because I don't see it happening with them.
Well, that's the issue, of course, is the leadership is what we have right now. And until it changes, that's what we're left with. John Robson, thank you so much. I really appreciate this tour d'horizon of history and why it matters to now as we face these challenges. And I wish you a commemorative Remembrance Day as well.
Thank you.
Very interesting commentary from Dr. John Robson about some of the historical antecedents to where we are now. His basic point being, we've been there before. In rising powers and how we deal with them, and also some of the economic disparity issues that are part and parcel of our politics as well as our economics. So I take that as an interesting topic to have before Remembrance Day. I hope it was for you as well. Thank you for watching.